I remember that day, June 25th, 1975, our first day as students at the National Institute of Design, NID in Ahmedabad. We entered a dream world. The landscaping, architecture, and beautiful spaces mesmerized us. The smell of nature still lingers in my memory. A few days later, we learned that NID also had a new executive director. We gathered in the auditorium to meet the director. He handed over to each one of us a beautiful printout of a poem. What a beautiful way to be introduced to a new director as we were entering a new school for a new experience.
Desiderator by Max Ehrmann. Go placidly amid the noise and haste, and remember what peace there may be in silence. As far as possible, without surrender, be on good terms with all persons. Speak your truth quietly and clearly, and listen to others. Even to the dull and the ignorant, they too have their story. Avoid loud and aggressive persons. They are vexations to the spirit. If you compare yourself with others, you may become vain or bitter. For always there will be greater and lesser persons than yourself. Enjoy your achievements as well as your plans. Keep interested in your own career, however humble. It is a real possession in the changing fortunes of time.
Was that I had come back to India at the instant from the US at the instance of Ramesh Tapat, the late Ramesh Tapat, editor of Seminar, and a dear friend, Jason Lacuna, and another friend, Shada Prasad. All three of these were part of the Harper Review Committee, which was a very strong reaffirmation of the vision and the mission of the National Institute of Design. In fact, the only external person who encouraged me to come to NID and take this was Sensitivities. And he spoke to me on the phone and he said, for God's sake, go there and do it. And I had read his book, House for Mr. Biswas, which to me is a great piece of literature. So I wrote to him after this book of his came out. And I said, look, Vidya, the things that you have written about, you've written about brilliantly. But you know, and I know, that none of those things actually happened. You have used your imagination to create an NID that is almost a caricature of itself. And you have done this because you simply couldn't take the positive energy on the campus at NID or any other campuses you visited in Ahmedabad. He was shaken by Ahmedabad because he was looking for doom and destruction. And he thought Ahmedabad should go the way of Calcutta in an area of darkness. And he was greatly frustrated. In fact, he claimed he had almost had a nervous breakdown while he was living with me in Ahmedabad because he found he couldn't write. So anyway, I said to him, look, this book is going to go through a lot of reprints. And I have just one request of you as a friend, that the next time it's printed, In very small letters on the spine at the bottom, please put the word fiction. I see. But the future of Khadi is immense. It is the fabric for a sustainable planet. And that's what should be taking it into the future. So he said, I go to the loom and I ask the loom what I should do, and the loom will tell me. So in those few words, he communicated to me the power of the sector, the culture of the sector, the values that come with this sector that we call artisan. The whole culture that has come down these thousands of years, this man was able to tell me by explaining to me, that his way to deal with this personal tragedy was to go to his loom.
Hello there. Today I bring to you a dialogue with Professor Ashoke Chatterjee, the former executive director of the National Institute of Design. AC, as is popularly known, has a wide range of experiences from international civil services, engineering industry, to development such as drinking water, sanitation, education, rural development. He was president of Crafts Council of India for 20 years and pioneered a rural development project through collaboration of Indian Institute of Management and the National Institute of Design in a small village called Jawaja in the state of Rajasthan. AC is closely associated with the Gandhi ashram in Ahmedabad, and his views on grassroots level transformation of India through handicrafts reflect his values, his beliefs, and his vision. So I bring to you Ashoke Chatterjee for a dialogue about the legacy of India's imagination. Over to AC. Hello, Mr. Chatterjee. It's so nice to see you again. I'm so glad that we stayed in touch. I was privileged to have you as a keynote speaker at my book launch 3 years ago.
My God, has it been 3 years? Oh.
Yes. And in fact, I've published 3 books since then, that being the first one. And I think this COVID time has been a moment of reflection, at least for some people. For many people, it was a moment of survival with no time for reflection.
Yeah.
And for others, it was a moment to just wait for the old times to come back.
Right. But the old times don't come back. You have to recreate something new.
Someone told me about a quote which said that you never see the same river again because you change and the river changes. So your engagement with the river is always a new moment.
Right, correct.
So that's what life is about. And I think we need to go with the flow and find our purpose and our, what we want to do with the water of the river.
That's correct.
And what a coincidence that you dedicated a big part of your life to water. And
yeah, that has been a big part of it, to basically to drinking water and to natural resource management. The problems have become even more intense in these years since that engagement. So it's hard to know that one sometimes feels one failed. On the other hand, I don't really know how this particular problem of water, which is so critical, is going to be resolved unless we change the whole paradigm of development. It's linked to that. And changing that paradigm of development seems to be extremely difficult. these times.
So I want to go back in memory to June 25th, 1975. That was my first day at NID. That was also your first year at NID, if I'm correct.
Yeah, I arrived a few days later.
Yes, and
He declared.
then of course it was the first day of emergency. It was also my birthday and Jogi's birthday, so too many things coming together. But what I remember most is you sharing that poem with all of us, Go Placidly.
Right.
And that's what gave us a peek into you as a human and not as an executive director with a mandate to impose structure and discipline and whatever that might be. Uh, I think it was a beautiful way of introducing yourself to the community.
Yeah, that's a great piece of literature which I came across during my years in Washington, D.C.
So, what inspired you to share that poem with us?
I think largely because I can't be absolutely sure what my thinking was at that time, but I know that I and many others were shaken by what was happening in the country. And one already knew that NID had gone through very, very difficult times. And I was supposed to be part of the resolving. There was no guarantee at that point that the difficult times are over. I landed at NID at the time when many of those crises were at their height. So I think the need to be reflective and to find one's own center was certainly something that I felt I needed because I was coming to a place which I didn't know, which everyone except maybe two or three people had told me not to come and not to touch it because it would be an impossible situation. But one took the risk and one came, and one is never sorry for that. But at that time, the need was to garner all one's interior resources. And already NID had managed to come through a difficult time by garnering its own inner resources. So I thought this might be something that people would like to see.
And when whoever selected you at that time, I'm very sure there were some thoughtful people behind it, not just a group of bureaucrats in industry ministry. Did they articulate to you what was it about you that they thought you would be the person to bring NID out of those painful years into a path of healing and regenerating and marching ahead?
Well, it would be nice to believe that they thought that I had some qualities for that, but actually, it was a combination of things. For one, they couldn't find anybody. Nobody wanted to come to it. It was being written off as a lost cause, and there was talk about closing down the institute and turning the building into a technical training institute, all kinds of rubbish. But the sort of confluence of circumstances was that I had come back to India at the instant from the US at the instance of Ramesh Tapat, the late Ramesh Tapat, editor of Seminar, and a dear friend, Jason Lacuna, and another friend, Shada Prasad. All three of these were part of the Harper Review Committee, which was a very strong reaffirmation of the vision and the mission of the National Institute of Study. And the sense was that, look, we need somebody who understands what has happened at NID And I knew that partly through my association with Ramesh, Jason, and Jawaja Project, but also through my friendship with Charles Eames. And basically, I think the other thing was that if they did talk to other people, I don't know if they did, but it was very clear that nobody wanted to come. In fact, the only external person who encouraged me to come to NID and take this was Sensitivities. And he spoke to me on the phone in those days when phone calls were not as easy as they are today. And he said, for God's sake, go there and do it. I then realized that he had always longed to come to NID because, as you know, he was a great designer himself. But nobody ever asked him. And NID was basically a closed shop. Basically, people from Ahmedabad and Gujarat, very little contact with anybody else. And certainly somebody like Ray, who should have been one of the first people to come to the campus, was never contacted. But he knew how significant this experiment was. And his encouragement was very important. Of course, Ramesh and Jason and Shada Prasad and Popul Jaikar, whom I didn't know before, but who I came to know through this process. I had been in touch with NID before. It's in two ways. One was at the very start of my career in Washington, D.C., the Eames exhibition, Jawaharlal Nehru and his India, came to Washington. And I had just arrived, and the Indian community was asked to produce a bunch of volunteers who would help to get this exhibition into the Smithsonian and to help the management of the exhibition while it was on in the city. So I was dragged in there, and that's how I came to know Charles Eames. I never dreamt that I would end up at his institute. But there was talk about NID and how this exhibition had been created as a way of building faculty for NID. And that really interested me because during my engineering career, I had been involved with industrial design, the whole school of industrial design at that time. But one understood why this was important. And then when I came back to India, it was to the India Tourism Development Corporation, which under Ramesh Tapat had decided to use design as India's USP for tourism. So that brought me in touch with many in the Indian design community at that time. This is in the mid-60s, 65. And also with NID as a client. But I did notice that dealing with NID was extremely difficult, that I was not able to do any project with NID. It was just impossible to deal with that. So when I realized the problems that were going on with NID, it became clear that here was a national cause which needed to be protected. And the team that was then teaching and practicing at NID were full of promise, but really they'd been groomed in this rather hothouse Sarabhai environment where the rest of the world is kept at arm's length. And my task, I thought, would be for a year or two, but just to give them some management confidence that will help them to go forward. Of course, that turned out to be 25 years.
It's very interesting that Ramesh Tapat at that time was one of the brave fighters through his seminar of the emergency. And he was amongst the people who facilitated you becoming a part of NID. So it's kind of an interesting thing for me.
Because you have to remember that when Mrs. Gandhi chose the tourism sector as an area in which she thought an experiment could take place to professionalize the managers in the public sector. She chose tourism because she thought that it was a comparatively low profile, unknown area. The bureaucrats would not make a big fuss. And Ramesh was the chairperson of the ITDC. And she had great respect for Ramesh. So it was the Thapa committee report and his contact with Gandhi which protected NID from being closed down. And then when he said, no, we have to get the director in there, she gave him full support. Of course, a few months later came the emergency, and her relationship with Ramesh became something completely different. Yet, throughout that period, her respect for him was always there. And one sensed that in some of the interactions that I was to have with her as NID director, that she respected the institute. She wanted to see it flourish. And instinctively, she understood design, which was something very rare.
What I'm also learning is that the robust institutional structure that was set up by our founders was strong enough that even when some people strayed, such as Mrs. Gandhi, straying into a period of autocratic experimentation, the structure was sound enough that it allowed her to step back and think of the best interest of the country outside of her own selfish interest also, or her survival instinct. Another that no matter that, because of that, she even gambled with declaring elections. A gamble played, but at least somewhere at deep level, it shows that she still wanted to come back to the democratic structure to test her popularity or her relevance to the politics of the time. So coming down to that, I had another.
She's a very complex person, very, very hard to understand what her motivation was. But in a sense, I think the real issue was the structures were not that strong because she was able to do what she was able to do and get away with it. So even at that stage, structures were vulnerable. And I think the people who are now in command of affairs in our country today, they learned all those lessons that they're practicing today from her. How to attack institutions, how to render them weak.
But at the same time, when you say they were not strong, I would say we had the ability to bring about constitutional amendments that made it stronger. So post-emergency, the whole doctrine of you cannot change the fundamental structure of the Constitution, that Constitution amendment was brought in.
Which is now they're wanting to challenge.
Yes.
But I think there's one other issue which comes up very clearly in Mrs. Jayaka's wonderful biography of Indira Gandhi. And that is that for whatever other failings she had, Indira Gandhi had a conscience. And I don't think some of her successors, including the present one, can be faulted for having a conscience.
I completely agree with you. I just want to put on the record something else. You might have a memory of it since you were in the tourism department. When Barrister Nath Pai passed away, he was a big critic of Mrs. Gandhi, but he had a good relationship with him. But when he passed away, she appointed his wife, Crystal Pai, she opened a new India tourism office in Vienna, and she gave her a lifetime appointment there. And Crystal was the manager of the India tourism office in Government of India tourist office in Vienna until her retirement. And then after her retirement, per Mrs. Gandhi's instructions, the office was closed down. Possibly financially it was not viable, but it was a decision she made. So that also showed interestingly that, like, though Nathpai was her opponent, she cared for his wife when he passed away.
Well, very extraordinary woman, and the tragedy is that she could have taken this country on another path because she had the power, she had the influence, and she had the guts, which very few people do. But unfortunately, now what has happened is that the evil that she did, one can call it that, has become the resource for these people to keep talking about what about, what about, what about. And the what about is going on and on as the excuse for whatever damage they want to do to our institutions and to the Constitution.
Yes.
Because they have a terrible example to point to.
So one question I have is, through the independence struggle and later when we had some people of great intellectual caliber having a discourse, arguments, differences of opinion, and through that churn of debate emerged a vision and systems. They were not perfect, but it began to emerge. Through that dialogue, the emphasis was more on ideas and visions and less on personalities. If certain people became heroes, it was because people made them heroes, but they were not putting out personality cult. They were not building personality cult. Where did that change? Now what we see is even people have begun to mistrust dialogue and dissent and arguments, and they are blindly following a single idea, ideology, or an idol. Where did that change?
Well, again, the personality cult started with Mrs. Gandhi. Wasn't there before. Her father could have made his leadership into a personality cult, but he very, very deliberately did not. Neither did Gandhiji, neither did Sardar, but Mrs. Gandhi did. And the emergency was the beginning of that. And that's the real tragedy, because she created the template which someone like Modi has tried to perfect. But unfortunately, it's very, very unfortunate, because I think she was sort of schizophrenic. She had this one side of her which had a conscience, which had democratic impulses, and which was courageous. On the other hand, she had this obsession with herself and unfortunately with her family. And when push came to shove, she allowed that to take over. That's all history now. We can't do anything about it. We can only hope that people will learn their lessons.
You know, when I'm talking to these people for this project of mine, the legacy of India's imagination, people are coming out of woodworks, recommending other people who are doing some great work in grassroots level. And they're literally within one email, they're coming out and saying, yes, I will join this conversation. There's almost like I see it as a re-emergence of a new renaissance where people doing some good work in pockets are feeling the call of the times to share their stories and through that to create a new zeitgeist. Would you agree with that?
Yes, I think so. I think you're right. A lot of people in our country are struggling with this and asking, why does decency, if you like, and love for this country, why does it not come in as a critical mass to counter the forces, the fascism which is now driving this country? There's no easy answer for that, but it is happening. There are groups coming together in many places. There are lots of people who've been doing good work right through these years, including the terrible year of COVID. But the problem, as I see it, is that no political party actually represents them. And no political party is willing to openly take a stand to say that this is the India that we want. The Congress party, in a sense, has to be our hope, but they're nowhere near it yet. Every now and then you think that there's some hope of that, like the Bharat Jodo walk and so on. But then, where are they when these terrible crises happen? The party is nowhere, because it also tries to hedge its bets. It also doesn't want to see itself being labeled as pro-Muslim, and that's the single biggest problem in our country now, is the targeting of Muslims. And no party has come out in that defense. If they do, they talk about it in a roundabout way, but they won't come out with it in the way that Gandhiji did, to say that this is the basic cement that has to hold us together. And if you destroy this, then the country doesn't exist.
To your point, one Bharat Jodo Yatra is not going to do it. I think
it's meant to be the beginning of something, and maybe
yes.
It will. No?
Yeah, it will. It's a good beginning, but I feel what Gandhi did was he kept himself away from electoral politics, and he dedicated himself to, from the grassroots level, building the imagination and the tools required to get to that imagination for ordinary people. He was not building tools for grabbing power. He was building tools for getting to a dream which is inclusive.
Yeah, you're right. That's how he was able to sit at Sabarmati for 3 years, figuring out what he was going to do, and then came up with the Salt March. And knowing that immediately after the Salt March, he would be imprisoned. But he was able to mobilize people on a symbol which he knew would carry its message to every corner of the country. Unfortunately, some of his successors have learned at his feet, but in a very different way. And they have taken hatred as the catalyst and taken it to every corner of the country. So we're dealing with a very strange situation. That the example of the Mahatma is being used and adapted by his assassins.
Just as they have co-opted the legacy of Sardar Patel.
Yes, exactly.
Without actually going deeper into what Sardar Patel was or what he believed in.
Right.
See, when they travel around the world, they don't talk about Devras or Golwalkar Guruji. They talk about Gandhi and Sardar Patel. But they don't talk about what they actually said and meant and aspired for.
You're right. And there the tragedy is that the Sardar, who is a congressman, is not defended by the Congress party. And I think our present powers know that, and they use that to their advantage. To say,
I want to move to another space because I think there is enough dialogue going out about synthesizing the problems. But since my dialogue is about imagination and legacy of imagination, I want to go back again and I want to ask you, what ideas or people were influences to your own imagination of India or of humanity, whatever scale it was at? But what influenced you right from childhood through your years of working and into now? Which ideas and personalities influenced you?
That's a bit hard to answer in any succinct way. I think what about my family background maybe what there, because I took the India that I grew up in for granted. And I think many of us in my generation did that, and that was our mistake. We should not have taken anything for granted. But in my own family, very mixed one, part of my family is from the South. My grandfather ran away from home in the late 19th century, found himself in Columbia University, became an engineer, came back to Mysore and set up the first hydroelectric power plant in India in the very beginnings of the 20th century. And married outside his community, as has happened in all parts of my family. The other side, I had a grandfather who left Eastern UP and ended up as a journalist for Reuters in Bombay, and Bombay became the family headquarters. So between Bangalore, where my mother's family was headquartered, and Bombay, where my father's family was headquartered, we had an India which was very, very mixed, and our family was totally mixed. That was hard to find any couple in the family who came from the same linguistic or religious background. Complete confusion. And we didn't realize it was confusion. We thought this is the way things ought to be. And when freedom came, I think, we rather ignorantly thought of ourselves as prototypical Indians who owed allegiance to the country and not to any particular geography. So that clearly had an influence. What kind is hard to know. I was educated at an American school with kids from 30 countries. That obviously was an influence. And I think one of the biggest influences in my life was when, as a Chatterjee, I turned up in Calcutta for the first 10 years of my career. And I joined the engineering industry there. Now, I complained about Calcutta, I think, for every day of my life for 10 years. I thought it was fits. I thought it was chaotic, confusing, horrible place. I couldn't wait to get out of it. And I eventually did get out of it, and I ended up in Washington at the International Mercury Fund. When I landed up in Washington in those days, the days of the 60s, Vietnam situation, the Martin Luther King March, riots in Washington, and so on, I suddenly realized what I had left. And the city of Calcutta kept coming back to me in many, many ways as a kind of society which was caring, which was inclusive, and where I thought represented in India that I had to go back to. So I knew very soon that my future was not going to be in the US, it was going to be in India, whatever happened. And you have to keep in mind that in the 60s, when anybody was working in a UN organization and escaping, if you like, from India those days, it was considered absolute madness to want to go back to India. But I did, and I never regretted it. But when I look back, I think the huge influence of that city upon me, a city that I resented in the beginning because it seemed to want me to be a Bengali, which I wasn't, and seemed to want to mold me into something that I wasn't. And I mistook that for arrogance. It wasn't arrogance at all. It was an opportunity that they gave me which I missed. But when I was taken away from it, I realized how amazing that city and everything it represented, the intense suffering of the city, the intense resilience of the city, and the intense caring in that city for other people, which was a quality I took for granted until I hit Washington, D.C., where nice place, certainly I enjoyed my years there, but there was no sense that there was any big idea that was gripping, that could grip me, so long as I worked in an international institution. I was not involved in the politics of the life of the United States. So I think one of the big influences to me in that sense was looking back on India from the US and realizing things about my background, about my country, that I had taken for granted until I was removed from it. And then found that there was a quality to India which, in a sense, was me. And if I wanted to be a person with any sense of self-satisfaction, I would have to find my center back in that country, not outside it. So maybe that is a long-winded way of saying that there were a lot of influences. One of the most powerful was the experience of the city.
I love that. And I think the city as a metaphor emerged in your consciousness, and then it began to unfold what it offered. And for it to become a metaphor, you had to step away from it and not live in it.
That's right. And I've never been able to go back to Calcutta except for occasional visits. But the values it gave me, those have stood. Those have stood. And I've never found any other place in the world to match that. When I was in the US, one place that came anywhere near to it was New York City. So I used to run away from Washington as often as I could to New York, because New York also had that sense, it slaps you in the face, and then you begin to get hooked to the city and its people. And that dynamism is something that I respected about New York. I don't know any other city in the States that well, but Washington in those days was a city going through turmoil, and there was a lot of learning that one could take from Washington, and which I think possibly I did. But I knew this was not the place I wanted to go.
Now I understand the context in which your imagination evolved. So while we were at NID, this book came out.
Yes.
India Wounded Civilization. Though I don't remember the words, I do remember that you repudiated it, than engaging him in a dialogue.
And Vidya Naipal was a very dear friend, at least so I thought. And he stayed in that tumble-down building where I was staying. He stayed with me in Ahmedabad. He was my first guest. Earlier, he had stayed with me in Washington, D.C. when the riots were taking place.
When you look back today, what are your feelings, and would your reaction be different today if you were engaged with him today?
No, I reacted at that time. I wrote to him saying, look here, Vidya, you are a great writer and you're going to get the Nobel Prize. This was a joke between us ever since I first met him. And he stayed with me in Calcutta, and he stayed with me in Washington, and he stayed with me in Hong Kong. And I had read his book, House for Mr. Biswas, which to me is a great piece of literature. So I wrote to him after this book of his came out, and I said, look, Vidya, the things that you have written about, you've written about brilliantly. But you know, and I know, that none of those things actually happened. You have used your imagination to create an NID that is almost a caricature of itself. And you have done this because you simply couldn't take the positive energy on the campus at NID or any other campuses you visited in Ahmedabad. He was shaken by Ahmedabad because he was looking for doom and destruction. And he thought Ahmedabad should go the way of Calcutta in an area of darkness. And he was greatly frustrated. In fact, he claimed he had almost had a nervous breakdown while he was living with me in Ahmedabad because he found he couldn't write. So anyway, I said to him, look, this book is going to go through a lot of reprints. And I have just one request of you as a friend, that the next time it's printed in very small letters on the spine at the bottom, please put the word fiction. And he was so enraged that I lost a friendship. And even when he finally got the Nobel Prize, when I contacted him to remind him of our conversations and to congratulate him, he refused to accept my congratulations. His wife, his second wife, a Pakistani lady, sent me a note to say that he appreciated my comments. Well, when I wrote back to him again, I said, listen, you bugger, the least you could do is to sign your own thank you notes.
But don't people have the right to their ignorance?
Sorry?
I've learned people have the right to their ignorance.
Yes, sure they do. But he was a very close and at one time a very dear friend. And I lost that friendship. And I think he knew that he was being dishonest. And from what I understand, he later told people that what he had written was not fact. But I don't know if he did or not, but I'm told by people who knew him, including Patrick French, who was here at Ahmedabad University, and who's written a biography of Naipaul. He said that he came across my letters when he was researching Naipaul, and that Naipaul admitted that his experience in Ahmedabad had shaken him deeply and had challenged all the negativity with which he had up to then looked at the Indian future.
Interesting. So another question I have from those times. I remember there were two times within NID. One was when the student forum had happened, and one when the union started. People saw a different side of you. And because I was on the student side, I could see that a number of students saw you as an autocratic person who suppressed the student forum or who suppressed the union. What are your comments?
The student forum we never suppressed. In fact, the student forum became a very important part of decision making.
But that was a perception. That was a perception.
Yeah, but I think the perceptions are very much colored by the union. Now, you have to understand what I've learned later. But NID was going through a very, very tough time, as you know. And our margin of error was very, very small. And we were trapped. And the trap was laid for us by the CPI, Marxist-Leninist Party, and it was organized from Calcutta. Years later, a very distinguished Marxist, the late Nikhil Chakravarti, who was the editor of Mainstream magazine, he came to the campus and explained to me how this attack on NID had been organized. by the CPI-ML looking for a foothold or a toehold in Gujarat and deciding that the way to get it would be to attack a centrally aided institution, not any of the private sector ones, because the culture of private enterprise is too strong. They thought that was too risky. But they selected our campus. Why? Because we had the youngest students. And they told me if I closed the institute for 3 months, they would leave me alone. Because that would give them the symbol of their strength, which they were looking for. And it was a very complicated story, which only unfolded much earlier. I was quite innocent of what was going on until Nikhil Chakravarti was able to explain to me, as a Marxist, what had actually gone on. Why this campus was being attacked the way it was being attacked. Why its very slender financial resources were being spent on lawyers' fees. And we were trapped by that. On the one side, we had people entrenched in the Sarabhai clan who didn't want to see NID succeed. On the other side, we had the people who had said that design was Western nonsense, which was being brought in by a bunch of rich Gujaratis for their own entertainment. And there was, it was a trivial thing which did not deserve any serious attention. On the other side, we knew that India needed design. And we had a bunch of educators and a bunch of students who had stood up bravely to all that had happened. And NID never missed a single day of education through all the chaos before I came and then which the union brought onto the campus after I came. But the fact was that the attack on NID was a political plot. And I would not have known that if someone who knew the leftist parties and who knew this didn't have the decency to come to our campus and say, this is what is happening, and this is why it is happening. And there's nothing you can do to stop it. So this was a really important thing. And so one had to be extremely stern with the parties that were trying to use the student community against the administration. It didn't work because when push came to shove, support that I got from the students as well as from the teachers was what took us through. We had nothing else. We had no political influence. We had no money. We had no way of dealing with all this political skullduggery that was going on. But as Nikhil Chakravarti told the students, I don't know whether you were there when he spoke to the students.
No, I was not there.
But he said that the reason I've come here is to tell you, as the people who are in the vanguard of a new Indian profession, that one of the things you'll have to learn is to deal with corruption in society. And you are seeing on your campus the corruption that has come into the leftist movement, to which he said, I have given my life. And now I find that that movement to which I've given my life is attacking an institution like yours instead of protecting it. So whatever you do when you leave this institution, please understand that India is a very tough country to live in and to work in. And you will have to deal with these forces, just the way your director and others are having to deal with this. Do not give in. Your unity is all that you have. And he was right. We didn't give it.
So looking at a higher level away from that specific situation, what are your thoughts about collective bargaining or on unionization as an idea?
Well, I don't think there'll be any two positions on that. All segments of society, particularly those who are not powerful, need to be mobilized, need to come together in order to get a fair deal. I spent all my life with artisans, and that's their struggle. To create that level playing field. But to me, that's not an ideological issue, it's a moral issue. And it's a question of the last person in mind, caring for the last person in mind. This is why what happened on our campus to me was so incomprehensible, because we were looking after people. We were looking after people. We had schemes to educate the kids of our workshop staff. We were not able to implement it because of the union's intransigence. But there was clearly a lot of young people who should have graduated as designers, but on a parallel track of design education, not the same one that you were in. But we tried that. Today, other people have tried that with greater success than we had. People like Judy Frater, for example, in Kalaraksha and Kutch. But these ideas were all there. And keep in mind that only a few months after I came, we went to Jawaja. And so the question of understanding what the poor and the disadvantaged go through in this country was something we were experiencing firsthand. And we were trying to understand whether design had anything to give toward those people who were last in line. And those lessons we learned and are still learning from a place like Jawaja.
Excellent. So that takes me to my next question, which is Jawaja this year is the 50th year of Jawaja Project, correct?
Almost. 75 we went there.
So I could almost say that Jawaja Project is nearing 50 years. And it happened while we were there. And the collaboration between IIM and NID, specifically between you and Ravi Mathai, and then Neelam was involved in that. I don't know if Ranjan was involved in that. Probably yes.
Later, but Neelam, Krishna Patel, Helena Perentupa, of course, was a pillar of the whole.
Yeah, I can't separate my image of Neelam from the Jawaja bag. It is like such an integral part. So can you tell us a little bit about the vision, the collaboration, and the unfolding of the Jawaja project?
Well, you may remember that the Jawaja project started with Ravi Mathai stepping down as the director of IIM and asking himself whether there was anything he had learned through his work in corporate management that could be relevant to the gut level of problem solving in India. And what did he mean by the gut level of problem solving in India? He meant poverty and oppression. So he wanted to test himself. Is there anything that I know that can be helpful to people at that level? And if there is, then management is a discipline which needed to be brought to India. If it isn't, we have to go back to the drawing board. At that time, NID had gone through all these situations of near closure, and Ravi knew that this community had the resilience to put up with all that political upheaval and keep the institute going. So he asked the faculty at NID and the students, of which Neelam was one, what keeps you going? How come you haven't collapsed as a small, very poor institution, very poor facilities? People on very poor salaries. What keeps you going? And the answer that he got was that whatever their shortcomings, this community of educators and students had a passion and a vision. And they could see that the discipline that had been imported from the Bauhaus had a relevance. And they could see it around. So in those conversations, he said, well, I'm going to test what I know. And I'm going to a part of Rajasthan which I've been told has no possibility. So I'm going to test myself at that level. Why don't you come along with me? And that's how we went. We went there in July 1975, not knowing what we were getting into, and definitely not knowing that this would turn out to be a craft project. In fact, our first interventions in Jawaja were about tomato cultivation. So a handful of NID students just threw their tomato baskets on the ground and said, we haven't joined NID for tomato, we're going back. What's all this bullshit? So they went back, and Ravi said, yeah, you can go back. We are here to respond to the agenda which is given to us by this community. And everything we do is going to be driven by them. So whether they're going to use your design talents or interests, who knows? But you have to stick it out. What we're learning about is what the conditions are in India and what we collectively think we might be able to do. And if we can't do anything, we'll go back. Nothing needs to keep you. Craft came into the center of the Jawaja project because the only resources that we could find were in weaving and leatherwork, both at the very bottom of the social scale, both very oppressed communities, and both in the grip of the moneylender. And there is where Helena and Neelam and others started their work. What do we know that this community can make, that somebody will buy and give them money which they can hang on to, which the moneylender cannot grab away from them, and will give them a sense of hope? The objective of the whole effort was to offer an opportunity for dignity and hope. And it was that that took us back to Charles Eames' India report, where he ends his report by saying that the hope for such an institute is that it will deliver service, dignity, and love. And suddenly in Jawaja, in that heat and in that oppressive environment, those words came up. And we understood that this is why we were there in Jawaja. This is how we were going to test a discipline in a way which the Bauhaus never had to test it. And we began to find out that it worked. The same problem-solving design process that was imported from the Bauhaus was being applied in a village in Rajasthan. And it worked. It was not easy, but
how's the project doing now?
The project is, how does one say? There were two benchmarks for the project when it started. These communities were not allowed to drink from the village well. And you can imagine in the desert of Rajasthan what that means. They were also eating, most of them, once in 2 days. That's the research that the students and the project group came up with. So Ravi said, fine, we now have the indicators for what he called the rural university. Is there anything that we know that we can transfer to this community without making them dependent on either IIM or NID, which will enable them to eat twice in 1 day and will give them access to the village well? And that was a huge learning for the NID community. But here we are, the benchmarks are not market sales, They are access to rights. And is there anything that designers can do to bring those rights closer to their access? Now you have a community there which certainly eats more than twice in one day. They did finally get access to the village well, but they cautioned us not to distribute errors because they said very little has changed up here. The reason we have access to the village well is we have money in our pockets, and nobody can deny that. This is perhaps the only community in that part of Rajasthan that has never had to migrate, that has never had to work on relief projects, and where, and this is quite interesting, because it was never part of our project, where every single girl child has been educated right through school.
Wow. So one more question.
They still have huge problems, but they are there. And they are now entrepreneurs. They are, they've gone all over the country. They have a sense of self-respect. And perhaps the most interesting part of the book is the last bit, which is the contribution of people whose lives have been touched by Jawaja from all kinds of different walks of life and who have been transformed by their interaction with this community, which is a lesson to us that the real learning in Jawaja was what we learned from the artisans, not what we gave them, but what they gave us.
Right.
And what does that have to say for our country?
Yes. So another question comes to my mind is, how would you compare Jawaja experience with the Barefoot College experience?
Very different. The Barefoot College experience was also about livelihoods. It was also very much a craft project, but very different in its orientation. Barefoot College is not driven by the community. It's driven by Bankar's vision of bringing livelihoods to that part of Rajasthan, which he did very successfully. That was not the agenda for the rural university. The agenda for the rural university was self-reliance. What do you want to do? And is there anything that we know that can help you to do what you want to do? It was about building trust within these oppressed communities and about getting them to set their own agendas. That's not what the Barefoot College is about. Barefoot College is about an external institution with strong roots in Rajasthan, but set up to provide markets and employment. The rural university was not set up to provide markets and employment. It was set up to say, if you want markets and employment, what help can we give you? What can you take from us that will help you to do this? And so you have the products of the rural university who regard themselves as designers, not as workmen, but as designers.
Were there any, conversations between Rural University and Barefoot College to learn from each other's experience?
In the beginning, yes, because Ravi was on the board of the Barefoot College. But the Barefoot College, unfortunately, pinched the Jawaja designs. And Ravi was furious. Because at a time when Neelam's bags needed to find their own market and needed a chance to succeed, we suddenly found the designs being copied by Barefoot College. And they felt this is okay. You're in the public space, you have to learn to live with it. So Ravi stepped out of the Barefoot College and said that there was a basic feeling that we could not agree to disagree on this.
I get it.
That the commitment to the integrity of a rural community should be complete. And a rural community struggling in the way that Jawaja was struggling at that time, to have this done to them, to have their designs stolen, and that too by a like-minded institution, made no sense. But there were other people who stood with us, John Bissell at Fab India, for example, and others. So it was a lesson. And the good learning from that was that the artisans of Jawaja always treated the Barefoot College as equals. They did not resent them, but they made it clear that they were their equals, not inferior in any way.
So it was more of a social experiment than a design project.
It was an experiment in education.
Correct. The next area I want to cover, because you spent a lot of your time with the Crafts Council. Your mind is, you are associated with Gandhi Ashram, so you have a Gandhian framework in your mind. So my question pertains to the craft sector and specifically also khadi and village industry. I think KVIC was a big part of Gandhi's vision for creating employment in rural India. I'm not sure how they're doing right now. So between crafts and khadi, how are they doing? And what is your vision for them?
Well, KVIC is a very mixed bag. They've done some great things, no question about it. But they see themselves as a monopoly. For example, if you were to sell khadi, you would get immediately a lawsuit because they don't allow anyone else to use the word. They have lawsuits against Archana Shah of Bandej because inadvertently she advertised somewhere that we have got khadi stoles. They said, who told you could use that word? They have a case against Fab India. They have a case against an organization in Vancouver which has been helping Indian artisans for years and advertised a khadi sale in Vancouver and got a lawyer's notice. So as far as I'm concerned, KVIC has passed its time. It has no right to a monopoly on khadi. What khadi needs is a strong certification system that ensures that what is sent into the marketplace as khadi is actually khadi, and can provide that kind of certification to the understanding of the consumer. Because khadi is one of the world's greatest fabrics, and it doesn't need to be sold cheap. It meets all the requirements of what is now called luxury. It doesn't only have to be for the rich, but it is a great product, and it should command a good price for the spinner as well as for the weaver. And that's not a role that the KVIC is playing with any distinction. In fact, the reputation of most KVIC showrooms is a dismal one. There are exceptions, but it's pretty dismal. So that's KVIC. But the future of khadi is immense. It is the fabric for a sustainable planet. And that's what should be taking it into the future. But so long as you have KVIC there, distributing legal notices on everybody, including several NID graduates, it's an absolutely ridiculous situation.
Is the number of people weaving khadi gone up, gone down? How has it affected? Like people whose livelihood affects is dependent on making khadi?
Well, I don't have the figures with me, but it's a fairly sizable number. But the issue is that you have to look at it in two ways. You first have to start, as Gandhiji did, with worrying about cotton. So you have to worry about the soil, you have to worry about the water, you have to worry about the quality of the cotton. Then you have to promote the spinning of khadi thread, and then the weaving. And you do all of this with the power looms churning out fake khadi by the mile, and the market being full of fake khadi. Half of what sells as khadi is not khadi, it's fake. And many of these fake things are coming out of government-supported retail outlets. So it's a huge marketing challenge, and that challenge can only be met not by so-called Gandhians, whatever that means, but by people who have the marketing savvy that Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi had.
Absolutely.
Which was to put the consumer at the center and find out what the consumer wants and shift the whole focus to delivering what the consumer wants without compromising on the basics of what makes khadi a great fabric.
Wonderful. I have one last question, and that is inspired by the question you asked Dadi during a dialogue with Siddharth and Nandita. I was in audience that day. And you asked Dadi, in current difficult times, which of your work seems most relevant or has most promise to have the right impact? And he called out his production of Gandhi and Rumi. In the same vein, my last question to you is, in the current difficult times, which of the projects you are associated with show promise of finding a path to a more convivial future?
Well, I think that would be very easy to answer. It's the work that I do with artisans. Because keep in mind, not just Jawaja, but Jawaja is the one I most intensely sort of, it's part of me in a way in which I've not been engaged with other communities with that intensity. But keep in mind that the handmade sector directly addresses 11 of 17 sustainable development goals. Directly. So the handmade is not the past, it's the future. And that is the power of the Indian legacy of handmade products and fabrics. Unfortunately, the country does not respect this sector. We do not even know to this day how many artisans there are in India. The official figure is 11 to 13 million, and that's not a small number. But the unofficial figure, which is now taking currency, is 200 million. And according to Ravi Venkatesh, who used to be the chairman of Microsoft, the figure is closer to 250 million. And this is a country with the largest community of hand skills in the world. And it doesn't even know or care how many lives are actually depending on this. It has taken the Crafts Council of India 15 years of going from pillar to post to get the resources to do an economic survey which can help the government of India to calculate the numbers of people involved in this sector which we call handmade in India, and to calculate, to some extent at least, the contribution which they make to the national economy. This is not known. And we're anywhere between 200 to 250 million people. Whereas the IT sector, which at best employs 7 to 8 million people, gets all the attention and all the statistics that you can ask for. After 15 years, last month, we got some corporate funding to start work in 3 states to develop a methodology which can help the government of India calculate the impact of this sector on the economy. We are doing the government's work for them.
Wow.
With no help from the government. Nothing, not even 1 pie.
I know I said this was the last question, but I have one question, if you're with your permission. Do you have hope?
Yes, I have hope. Yeah, I have hope. It's very easy to give up on hope when you're almost 90 and you're in a country which is as toxic as India is today. But hope does spring eternal because I have grandchildren. I hope for them. I also take hope from, for example, a community like Jawaja. One of the weavers there, a chap called Onkar Ji, whom I've known now for 50 years, he has been a leader in that community. And his great pride and joy was that he had been educated, he had been able to educate his children, and his son had risen to be an accountant and had got a job in the ICICI Bank in Ajmer. And this was a huge achievement for him and his family. 2 months ago, the boy was going back to Ajmer from Jawaja, and he was killed in an accident at the railway station. So I didn't even know what to say. But I rang Onkar Ji and I said, what is it that you need now? And he said, I need to be at my loom. I said, but at this very difficult time, is there anything else that you might want? So he said, I go to the loom and I ask the loom what I should do, and the loom will tell me. So in those few words, he communicated to me the power of the sector, the culture of the sector, the values that come with this sector that we call artisan. The whole culture that has come down these thousands of years, this man was able to tell me by explaining to me that his way to deal with this personal tragedy was to go to his loom. So for me, that was a huge lesson, not just in resilience, but also in hope, because he hasn't lost hope.
And he's relying on his relationship with his loom for dignity.
Exactly. So what that loom represents is much more than a piece of machinery.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. This was so wonderful.
Most welcome. Thank you. Good to talk to you. Nice to be with you. And I hope that we'll see you here soon.
मतलब मोरला लव तो तू या घो जा एक तो ढोयण हरो जरे अरे माथे तो जीधा असा गिरीवर जा मोरला आम्ही कांकर पेट भरा साजी ऋतू आवे नो बोलिए जरे अरे मारा हाट मरा गेली થા ગેલડી તું લાંબા નો બાંધ દોર દોર આ તો ગાળે ગાળે ગે કતા જ રે અરે તું કેટલાક મારસ મારે ટોડલે બેઠો રે મોર ક્યાં બોલે